Hi, there you are. So my paper is titled, maybe kind of colloquial question, so what? On hermeneutics, perspectives, and questioning the self-evident. And I have to say, I'm very glad that this conference is happening and that we question what we are actually doing in theology and in exegesis especially. And I was incredibly happy, especially, that this last panel is asking the question of why? Why are we doing this? Because I think it's a very important question, which tends to get sidelined in our daily work. And the question of why is what I, in my own practice, translate as, so what? And that's a question that pops into my mind often in the context of my academic work. We do a lot of work to analyze a text, compare texts, or find something out about their background. Important work, and yet, often, I'm missing something like a conclusion. What do we learn from this new work? How does it change our understanding of the Bible or of theology or of how thought works or things like that? So to be very clear, this is not about applicability. It's not about asking, okay, so how can I preach it or something, which is a question we do get asked often by our students. This is not what I want. No, it's asking about ourselves, what conclusions and understandings we can draw from our work. So what is also a question that we as an academic discipline have to ask ourselves every now and then. And again, I don't argue for any direct usability of exegetical work. No, the main goal of scientific work is the furthering of knowledge and insight. But we must not keep that knowledge to ourselves. As public-funded universities in Germany, we owe the public something, at least the communication of our work. And we have to answer the question, why are we doing this theological work? In the description of this panel, there was a question: will people study the Bible in 10 years? Of course, this reflects a trend in Western societies, that religion and the Bible have lost relevance. And I don't think this will change in the next decade. Nevertheless, I think our knowledge and our abilities are of great importance in several ways. The first part of my talk will elaborate on that. And the second part will look at systemic factors of our knowledge production. And of course, I'm speaking from a German Western perspective here, and the whole context I'm thinking of is this German and Western context of knowledge production. So, why are we doing this? First of all, there are still many people for whom the Bible is a very important text, and many of them struggle with some aspects of it. Our knowledge as exegetes can help them understand the Bible better. Whether it's a struggle with Christology or the question of how to deal with homophobia or other questions, we can offer a wealth of knowledge and different interpretation. And we heard about that today and also yesterday in several papers. Also, to be understood today, the Bible needs to be interpreted in our modern context. If we are open and interested in the realities of people in different communities today, we can help with this work of connecting the ever-changing present questions with the biblical ideas. But in order to do that, we have to be open for and interested in what's happening around us. And we have to be willing to engage with whatever is happening in our communities. And this can only work if the people who do the academic work are able to understand the questions and issues of those communities. And as we have seen also in this conference, the default white, able-bodied, wealthy man is not able to understand or even to discern all of these different concerns. Second, the Bible is not only relevant in personal Christian contexts, but also in public discourses. But most of the time, it's used in frustratingly simplistic ways. We either have fundamentalist Christians who claim the whole Bible as the infallible holy word from God, or fundamentalist critique of the Bible that essentially works with the same preconceptions. See Richard Dawkins and other new atheists. And that's such a loss of diversity and accuracy. Let me give you just an example. I talked with a young woman and she said, yes, well, I'd like to be a Christian, but I believe in evolution theology, so that means I can't be a Christian. Yeah, that is one way that Christianity is understood in Germany, in parts at least. And it reminds me of what Anja said and what Andrea Pilchmeier said today, these kind of lack of knowledge. So even outside the Christian community, there is a big need for our knowledge, for our voices, to inform, to differentiate, to question simplistic claims. And again, that means we have to be open to these communities, these questions, that we are willing to communicate with people and groups outside of our academic enclosures. And even writing a blog and waiting for people to come and read won't be enough. We need to go where the conversations are happening, be it social media or real meetings, and add our voices to the discussions, which reminds me of Tahina's work as a public theologian in Madagascar, and also Rathi's paper at the beginning of the conference. Finally, I want to look even further, beyond the Bible. Let's take the whole society into view. Because I think that we as theologians, and especially as exegetes, have learned methods that are incredibly valuable for modern societies in general. Let me explain. When people start to study the Bible in university, there are always preconceptions that get questioned and even shattered. I'm sure many of you experienced that. Like David's kingdom, or Noah's Ark, and even the stories of Jesus not being that special compared to stories about godlike humans or healing gods like Asclepius. Suddenly, you see many historical questions or many parts of your faith or the fundamentals of your faith being taken into question. And we, as theologians, have to deal with that, and we learn to deal with that. We learn to question the fundamentals of our belief, and we learn to differentiate between the historical and the narrative, between different aspects of truth, like how the stories of creation are scientifically speaking wrong, but their meaning is still valid. We learn how to stand on shifting ground. And to me, that sums up a lot of modern problems. People looking for something definitive, something to hold on to, be it a narrow understanding of natural sciences, only what natural sciences find out is the truth, everything else is wrong and irrelevant, an ideology, or just a strong discomfort with these modern times where nothing is sacred anymore. To that, I can only say, welcome to our world. We as exegetes had to learn to live with these modern times, with these uncertainties, and we had to learn to stand on shifting ground. And actually, I think it's fun. You can learn so much. We know how to deal with different perspectives and pluralities of opinions, both in the academic work, but also, and more importantly, in the biblical texts themselves. See Professor Hindi Naiman's paper from yesterday. And that brings me to my second point, the question of plurality and different perspectives within our field. And a great paper on that is Gail Yee's Presidential Address for SBL 2019. So yes, we do have that plurality of perspectives and methods. But these methods are not all ascribed the same value. At least that's how I see it in Germany, and I've also heard about it here in this conference. There is one method that is seen as objective and properly scientific, the bundle of historical critical methods. The historical critical method has been of great importance to theological work, and it still has great value. I agree with Professor Levine said yesterday that we still need it. But in the last decades, it became clear that it alone isn't enough to do everything we need to do. Other methods were added, literary methods like narrative criticism and reader response-oriented methods. At the same time, the admission of women and scholars from the Global South into academia led to the development of many new perspectives, such as feminist, womanist, disability studies, race-oriented, post-colonial, and many more readings. And that reminds me of Sharon Padilla's paper. And yet, when I first took a pro seminar in New Testament studies more than 10 years ago. We learned exegesis, and then there was one day dedicated to other ways of exegesis, which included feminist exegesis and all the other things. So again, there was exegesis, which meant historical critical method under a certain perspective, and other, which included everything else. That's why I've tried to visualize here in this table here, that there is one method that is seen as neutral, which is the historical critical exegesis. And then there's a perspective that seems to be neutral. And we both have other methods than historical critical exegesis. And we have other perspectives than this apparently neutral perspective. And we heard a lot about methods yesterday in the papers. And so I want to concentrate on the perspectives today. The white male Western perspective was, and as far as I can tell, still is, the default. It still appears to be objective, as seen by Moritz Greper's paper as well today. Whereas the other methods and perspectives are considered to have value, yes, certainly, but they're also suspect. Because they have a visible point of view, they have concerns, so they are seen as subjective and less scientific. These are just some examples. But as you know here, those so-called subjective perspectives have helped us immensely to understand the Bible better. They have led us to new discoveries, such as the role of women in the Bible, etc. I'm preaching to the choir here, but the fact that I thought I had to do that represents something of my context, Western German theology in the West. I felt I had a lot of explaining to do why those perspectives are important. Yeah, you can analyze that for yourself. So we see that these other perspectives, or so-called other perspectives, have very valuable contributions to make. That through them we can better understand the Bible and better connect it to our respective contexts. And through the appreciation of those other perspectives, we can gradually recognize that what seemed to be the default perspective is not purely factual and objective, but operates from a certain point of view, the white, Eurocentric or Western, androcentric, rather affluent, etc. point of view. As Ada Maria Isazi Diaz wrote, for too long, theology done by those belonging to the dominant culture, the dominant race, the dominant sex, has claimed to be objective. This so-called objectivity arises from the lived experience of dominant groups of society and ignores the lived experience of oppressed to the point of considering it deviant. And that brings me to my last point, namely, who does theology? As long as the people doing theology are all from more or less the same group of people, they will have a lot of preconceptions they don't even notice. Noticing the particularity of one's own perspective usually happens when one is engaging with other, different perspectives. Just as we long considered the white male perspective to be default, to be normal, we long considered theology done from this perspective to be normal. It was only through the admission of women and the participation of scholars from around the world that the work could begin to decenter the historical critical method, as well as the white Western perspective, to perceive it as a valuable but particular perspective among other perspectives. The decentering. And of course, this picture is very simplistic because I have a Western white male and then everything else only has one description. Of course, you'd have to make many, many different intersectional descriptions there. It's just a very, very broad model, but I think you get the gist. So decentering the former default perspective. That's the work that's being done today. And there's still a lot to do. Some examples. In Germany. In German theology, the vast majority of students and professors are still white and without what we call a migration background, which means that one or two of the parents would come from another country. About 50% of the students come from families with academic backgrounds, which is a ratio of 1:1. That ratio gets worse higher up the ladder. For PhDs, the ratio is already 1:10, meaning that for one student without an academic background, there are 10 whose parents went to university as well. And also the vast majority of our students are hetero and cis, able-bodied, and members of a Protestant church. And as you may kind of glance here, I'm writing a lot of vast majority because there's no data on this. Because hardly anyone seems to care. But why? Why is our student body, and much more the doctoral students and the faculty, still so undiverse? There are a lot of hurdles to earning a degree, a PhD, a professorship. And many of these hurdles have nothing to do with scientific excellence. To do a doctorate, you have to be financially secure enough to take the risk and to go through lean times. You have to have time for weekend seminars, special events and conferences, to stay in the evenings to network. Often important career opportunities open up over the evening beer. But you have to have the time and the social abilities for that. What about people who have kids? What about those who have a second job to support themselves? Or people who can't stay long for health reasons, whether physical or mental? Furthermore, you have to be extremely flexible, willing to move across the country or even across the continent at the drop of a hat. But what about your partner or your kids? In the 50s, a family was expected to follow the breadwinner, but these days our concepts of family luckily have evolved. But still, these expectations persist. And those questions of diversity in terms of race or migration background, which I sketched before, these are non-issues in German theology, which certainly is not due to the fact that we are all beacons of anti-racism. We're just not really looking at it yet. All those aspects limit people's chances to participate in academic theological knowledge production, microaggressions, no help in navigating the academic system, little understanding of mental health conditions, etc. All these hurdles are time-consuming, energy-consuming, and simply exhausting. And thus, people drop out because they think they are not good enough, because they don't publish as much, or attend as many extra events, or have to take a few mental health days off. And then they drop out of PhD programs or simply take longer, which looks bad for the next application, etc., etc. And these mechanisms are often hidden, and they sort out people that don't fit. And thus, academia is missing out on the true diversity of perspectives that we so badly need. We don't even notice because we say, yeah, it's just a matter of abilities. So what can we do? This is my last question. I have a few suggestions that we can really specifically do. The first is, let's focus less on CVs and more on the quality of people's works and proposed projects. As the Venner Grant Foundation, the biggest anthropological foundation in the USA, is now doing. Respect different people's needs when planning seminars and other activities. Have more support and counseling options at the university. Be more open to non-Christian exegetical scholars. And please, let's get away from the publish or perish mentality, because that in the end puts quantity over quality, and an overwhelming amount of papers and books are being published, while actual thinking, pondering of the so what questions takes a backseat. Thank you very much.